I just started a postdoc with Kevin King at the USDA ARS. So unfortunately, I don't have quite as much edge of field data to work through like Lindsay, our last speaker. And instead, I'm going to be talking about some of my dissertation work that I did while I was at the University of Notre Dame, studying both a two-stage ditch as well as cover crops adopted at the watershed scale. So I don't want to belabor this too much because a lot of us talk about it all the time. But as many of us know, agriculture is the dominant land use throughout the Mississippi River Basin, particularly here in the Midwestern Corn Belt. So this figure is just showing farms in that light green color, and we can see how dominant it is across the landscape. But excess nutrients that are applied to agricultural fields can either leave or run off of those fields and enter downstream water bodies, where they fuel or fertilize algal blooms, and when those algal blooms die and decompose, oxygen is stripped from the water column, creating these areas of little to no oxygen where organisms can no longer live. So in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a dead zone that occurs every summer. It could be anywhere from the size of Connecticut to the size of New Jersey, and that's primarily caused by nitrate. But closer to home here, we all know that Lake Erie suffers from similar algal blooms that are primarily caused by soluble reactive phosphorus, or SRP. And this is kind of compounded by the fact that peak runoff often occurs during these spring snowmelt and storm events, essentially putting all of those nutrients into those downstream water bodies during the spring and summer, creating these algal blooms right when people really want to be enjoying these systems. It's also compounded by conventional agricultural management practices, particularly surface and subsurface drainage systems that are prevalent throughout the Midwest. So in Indiana, where I did much of my dissertation work, more than 90% of the 50,000 kilometers of streams, or 30,000 miles of streams, are located within 500 meters of a row crop field. So they're prevalent, but they're also really close to these systems that they're also affecting. And on top of it, we're applying fertilizer to landscape, which can enter those streams via surface runoff or subsurface tile drainage systems. And while these practices all improve crop yields, they also reduce nutrient retention within the stream and impact channel stability within the stream. So the net result is really the increased export of excess nutrients and sediments to downstream water bodies, like I just kind of outlined. So the work that I'm going to talk about today occurred in the Shatto Ditch Watershed, which is an agricultural watershed located in Kosciuszko County, Indiana. And the ditch itself is actually a tributary of the Tippecanoe River, which is important because the Tippecanoe is listed as one of the Nature Conservancy's last great places. It has very high freshwater mussel diversity, so it's a system that we really want to preserve. The Shatto Ditch Watershed is about 1,300 hectares. And agricultural land use is the dominant land use in the watershed. About 80% of the area is either in corn or soybeans. And the stream is quite small. It's just a first order stream that averages about 120 liters per second, but can range anywhere from less than 10 liters per second to greater than 2,000 liters per second during a spring storm. And it has very high nutrient concentrations year-round, similar to other streams throughout the Midwest. So I'm going to split this presentation into two pieces, or two phases, kind of tracking what we've done in the Shatto Ditch. In the first, I'm going to talk about this in-stream practice, the two-stage ditch, and then I'm going to follow that up with talking about watershed-scale practice, which in our case we use cover crops. So I'm going to use this outline, or this timeline, as a way to organize the phases of this project. So in 2007, work in the Shatto Ditch really began when 600 meters of two-stage was constructed, and then that was studied from 2007 to about 2012. We later returned to the two-stage, about 10 years later to see how it was functioning after this long period of time. So two-stage ditch is an in-stream restoration practice, and it was really designed for channel stability, or engineered for channel stability. So agricultural streams, the sort of classical trapezoidal ditch, has very flashy discharge or hydrograph. So when precipitation events occur, instead of a stream being able to sort of spread out and slow down the way it would in a floodplain or a natural system, depth increases, which increases the power of the stream and really erodes those channel banks, which causes all these issues with a loss of land. So the actual two-stage instead creates these mini floodplains within the system, allowing high flows to then spread out and slow down onto these benches or floodplains, considered the second stage of the system. And our hypothesis would be that this also increases sedimentation, so retention of particles on those floodplains, but also nutrient retention, so allowing nutrient removal on the floodplains as well. So this is what the Shatto Ditch looked like prior to the two-stage construction, just a classic channelized ditch with very wide buffers, which was an advantage for us. And then the two-stage was constructed in 2007, and you can see where the backhoe sort of went in and just peeled back those channel slopes to create 3 to 4 meter floodplains on each side. And then this is what that system looks like after just one growing season. So vegetation is reestablished really rapidly on the floodplains, and really we haven't lost any function because those grasses came in so quickly. So a lot of studies have demonstrated that channel stability is improved with the two-stage, but the next question was really, does the two-stage improve water quality? So we first measured turbidity, or water cloudiness, within the system, and this is very small, so I apologize. But what this figure is just showing is average turbidity in channelized systems in the gray compared to downstream two-stage systems in the sort of red dark bars here. And the take-home from this figure is really that in every two-stage that we measured, turbidity was lower in the two-stage than in the upstream channelized ditch. And the mechanism behind this is really that those benches are slowing water velocity during storms especially, allowing sediment and, we would assume, associated phosphorus to be retained on those floodplains. We also measured N removal via denitrification, or the microbial process that converts nitrate to dinitrogen gas, permanently removing nitrogen from the system. And what we found is that denitrification, or N removal, in this green bar was 3 to 24 times higher on the floodplains than it was within the mainstream channel. So we were really removing a lot more nitrogen with these added floodplains. And this was largely because those floodplains add area to the system, so they're designed to triple the width of the main channel, and by doing so, they provide more bioreactive surface area for the microbes that are converting nitrate to dinitrogen gas. And this is just highlighting Shatto within those studies. So the two-stage, these studies really highlighted that the two-stage is a viable nutrient management practice in our sort of toolbox of nutrient management. But it also revealed some best practices that are associated with it. Really, a two-stage should be designed to inundate frequently, so more than 12 times per year is ideal. It also is better if it retains tile flows. So if those tiles are actually discharging onto the floodplains will be working to remove sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen from that tile discharge water. And then finally, the floodplains should be vegetated, so they're allowed to sort of age over time. And this last point gets to the work that we kind of returned to 10 years later, looking at the Shatto Ditch and seeing if its function had improved or stayed the same, how it compared. So I just want to remind you that the two-stage was built in 2007, and at the time we established a treatment reach, which was the two-stage, and then an upstream control, which was a channelized ditch. And this figure here is just highlighting where those two systems were. Here's the control reach, and the downstream two-stage was at this northern end of the figure. This is what those two systems looked like at the time of construction. So the two-stage here, I showed you this picture already, and this is what the upstream channelized ditch looked like. But importantly, there was no maintenance or dredging that took place in that upstream reach for 10 years, since that 2007 timeframe. So this is what the two-stage looks like after 10 years. It looks very similar to what it looked like 10 years ago. And this is what the upstream channelized ditch looks like. So as you can see, the stream has sort of started to form its own floodplains, creating those erosional events, those bank slumping events that are creating floodplains along the stream channel. So this is what we really wanted to compare, was looking at how floodplain function and removal compared between the two-stage and this now newly channelized but naturalized system. And we did this by comparing N removal again, and we found that denitrification was 30% higher in the two-stage, in this red bar, compared to that upstream channelized system. And this was really driven by soil organic matter. So the two-stage had about 22% higher soil organic matter than that channelized system. So all of the vegetation that had reestablished so rapidly after just one growing season, those cycles of growth and decomposition really built up the soil organic matter within the floodplain, fueling things like denitrification. So just in summary from this section, we found that the two-stage really jump-started ecosystem function, in this case N removal. The area of the two-stage was a big part of that too. So the two-stage floodplain was about 6 times larger than that channelized system. And primarily, that was constructed in one day. So it would take over 30 years for this channelized system that's creating its own floodplain to catch up to what we created in just one day. Not to mention the loss of drainage that you might have in a system like this, where the two-stage has been shown to adequately drain fields sort of regardless. So while both of these systems effectively remove nitrogen, the two-stage implementation really restored that rapidly and required little to no maintenance over time. Okay, so I'm going to briefly come back to my timeline here, because this is what we've already shown, that the two-stage increases bank stability, it increases denitrification, and it also improves water quality. But the take-home point from some of this work was that that two-stage, at 600-meter reach of two-stage, only decreased the total nitrate leaving the watershed by about 10%. So there wasn't a significant impact of that short reach on the total load that was leaving the watershed. And that was primarily because we were doing nothing to the landscape, right? We were changing nothing about the source or the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus that was entering the system. So that's when we really started to think about this as a watershed scale project. And that is when we applied for a grant to work on implementing cover crops at the watershed scale and looking at how that impacted water quality, really addressing the amount of nutrients that are entering from the landscape. So the practice that we chose was cover crops because they have the potential to address nutrient loss from agricultural fields, primarily because they sort of attack or address two big issues, which is bare soil during times of high nutrient loss, that sort of spring period. So cover crops are just planted at or after harvest. They can establish roots in the fall, and this is a picture of cover crops in shadow in the fall where they were growing for about 2 months. Some crops will then overwinter and grow back in the spring during these critical times of both nitrogen and phosphorus export. And field scale studies have shown that cover crops can reduce nitrate loss from tile drains by 13 to 94%. That's a big range, but that's because these studies have been conducted from Delaware to Iowa. But the goal of our study was really to examine the influence of planting cover crops at the watershed scale on working lands, so farms that were being managed by producers and not on these experimental farms where every piece was being controlled. So the first year of our project was really a pre-treatment year when only about 320 acres, these 2 fields here, were planted in cover crops independently by a farmer who had been doing it for a few years. In the fall of 2014, cover crops were then planted on about 1,600 acres, not hectares, throughout the watershed, which equates about 67% of the total croppable area within the watershed. And then that percentage, about over 60%, was maintained from October 2014 to October 2016 for the next 2 years. The cover crop that was chosen was primarily annual ryegrass. We didn't stipulate anything or tell farmers what to plant, but we had one sort of leader within the watershed, and that is why most of the farmers chose annual ryegrass. We had a few fields that were cereal rye. But our goal, again, was just to really saturate the watershed with cover crops, and then isolate the effects of that practice, measuring and then measure dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus loss. So these are just some pictures of cover crops in Shatto. So this is that same photo of annual ryegrass establishment in the fall. This is not from Shatto. This is from a field day in Jasper County, Indiana, which was really just showing the depth of the roots from annual ryegrass using a soil pit. This is a photo from Shatto in the spring. So coverage across the fields was quite good for most years. You can see it's variable. There are spots where the cover crops may not have taken, but for the most part we had a lot of cover crop establishment throughout the watershed. And then this is just a quick comparison to something that would be completely bare. So for our methods, I would have loved to have what Lindsay has, which is those wonderful edge of field locations. We did not have that. They are very expensive. So instead, we identified tile outlets along this 8 kilometers of stream, or 5 miles of stream, where Shatto begins as a tile drain and then flows sort of northwest to the Tippecanoe River. And then we began collecting water samples at a representative subset of tile drains throughout the watershed, as well as the watershed outlet, which is right here. All of the water samples that we collected were analyzed for both nitrate and phosphorus, and we also measured flow, instantaneous flow at the tile drain every time we collected a sample. So first we're going to look at some temporal patterns of nitrate. I'm going to orient you to this graph really quickly. So average nitrate is on the y-axis and time is on the x-axis. So each individual dot here represents average nitrate concentration from samples collected from the stream in blue, tiles without cover crops in brown, and tiles with cover crops in green. And what we can see is during this pre-treatment year, when those 2 fields were planted in cover crops, tiles from fields with cover crops had lost a lot less nitrate, or had lower nitrate concentrations than tiles without cover crops. And then when we compare that to the following 3 years, we see that nitrate concentration in tiles from fields with cover crops is variable, but it's still lower, especially in this 2016 year, which was a great year for cover crop establishment. Temporal patterns of SRP are slightly different. And I just first want to point out that the magnitude of SRP concentration is much, much, much lower than nitrate. So there's a lot less SRP that's actually being lost from agricultural fields than N. But in the 2013 year, we found that this is much messier too. Tiles without cover crops were extremely variable, generally higher than tiles with cover crops, but always lower than the stream itself. After cover crop planting, there's a lot less variability in tiles with cover crops, but again, this concentration is always lower than the stream. So I mentioned that every time I collected a water sample, I also measured flow, and I used that to then calculate mass loss by just multiplying the nutrient concentration by that instantaneous flow and sort of scaling up to the day. And by doing this, we can compare average loss, or instantaneous flux, from tile drains across individual seasons. So for this figure, average nitrate flux is on the y-axis, season is on the x-axis, and during the pre-treatment year, we found that tile drain nitrate loss from tiles with cover crops was much lower than tiles without cover crops. And when we looked at this over the next 3 years, we found a similar pattern, and if we carry this line of 2013 tiles without cover crops forward, we can see that in the spring specifically, tiles with cover crops were exporting between 50 and 80% less nitrate than tiles without cover crops. So this just shows us that there's a potential that cover crops could be reducing nitrate loss from agricultural fields. And when we look at this for SRP, we see similar patterns where tiles with cover crops are exporting less phosphorus than tiles without cover crops, And again, carrying the spring 2013 line forward, we see this 50 to 80% reduction in spring export or spring loss of SRP. So again, cover crops have the potential to reduce SRP loss from the agricultural fields. But our ultimate goal was really to look at watershed export and to see if watershed scale planting of cover crops impacted watershed scale export from the system. So in order to do this, we used a stage discharge relationship, which is just the relationship between water depth and stream flow to estimate daily discharge from the bottom of the watershed. We then used a relationship between concentration, so in-stream water sample concentration of nitrate and phosphorus, with that discharge to estimate daily concentration of nitrate or phosphorus. And then finally multiplied that daily estimate of discharge by the daily estimate of nutrient concentration to estimate NRP exported per day. But again, I just want to remind you that we have been studying this watershed since 2007. So we actually have a 9-year record of both water samples, of nutrient concentration, both nitrate here in the green and SRP in this orange, prior to cover crops. So from 2008 to 2013, we have this pre-cover crop period. And then from 2014 to 2016, we have this post-cover crop period. So we have this long-term record of discharge, nitrate, and SRP that we can use to look at annual export from the watershed and compare between this pre- and post-cover crop period. So when we do this, we can see that in the total annual nitrate export, or yield here in kilograms per hectare, in years before cover crops in the brown bars, and comparing that to years with cover crops in the green bars, we see that the mean is lower in years with cover crops by about 11%. So watershed export is slightly lower in years with cover crops than years without cover crops. Similarly for phosphorus, we see again this relative decrease in the mean or the average of total SRP export from the watershed before and after cover crop planting, and this is a reduction of about 30%. But we can also see that there's a lot of variability between years, and this is primarily driven by flow. So Lindsay did a great job, our speaker before me did a great job talking about the importance of flow on nutrient export, and this is just one of those indications. So years when there's a lot more flow, like 2015, our export is a lot higher, especially for phosphorus. So this is something that we really need to take into account when we're comparing these values. So in conclusion, for our cover crop portion, we found that both nitrate and SRP concentration from tiles with cover crops was lower than tiles without cover crops. We also found that nitrate and SRP flux was lower from tiles with cover crops than tiles without cover crops. We found that we had this trend of average watershed nitrate and SRP export being lower than during years with cover crops than years without cover crops. But it's important to note that this is really challenging to detect statistically. So those differences are not statistically significant. While we see these trends, these really important trends of declines, it's not something that we can report necessarily with confidence yet. But all in all, we find that cover crops really may help address issues of NNP loss from agricultural fields, especially when planted at the watershed scale. So with that, we have a lot of people to acknowledge. Their names are all very small here, so sorry. But particularly the landowners within the Shatto Ditch Watershed, who are always very gracious, and all of the people that we work with at the Soil and Water Conservation District in Kosciuszko County, as well as the NRCS.